a lone voice can shake an empire. In the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was suffocating under its own weight, one man picked up a guitar and gave a generation something to believe in. This is the story of Viktor Tsoi, the voice of rebellion, the poet of the perestroika, and a legend who will never die.
Сегодня кому-то говорят до свидания, завтра скажут прощай навсегда. Залит сердечная рана. Завтра кто-то, вернувшись домой, достанет в руинах свои города. Кто-то сорвется с высокого крана.
Viktor Tsoi was born on June 21st, 1962, in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. His father, Robert Tsoi, was of Korean descent, a rare background in the largely Slavic Soviet Union. His mother, Valentina, was Russian. From an early age, Tsoi was drawn to art and music, absorbing the sounds of Soviet and Western rock. At the time, rock music in the USSR was not merely entertainment, it was contraband. The state-controlled media promoted patriotic marches and classical compositions, but Western bands like Led Zeppelin, the Stones, and the Beatles found their way into Soviet households through illegal copies recorded on discarded X-ray films known as bone records. Tsoi's first musical attempts began in the 1970s as part of the underground scene in Leningrad. He played bass in a little-known group called Ward No. 6, named after Anton Chekhov's short story about a psychiatric ward, an early hint at the existentialist themes he would later explore. But it wasn't enough. He needed his own voice, his own words. By the early 1980s, Tsoi had formed his own band. They called themselves Kino, a simple universal name, meaning cinema in Russian. It was fitting. Their music felt cinematic, stark, evocative, rich in imagery. Kino emerged from the Leningrad Rock Club, an underground but semi-tolerated institution where Soviet rock bands could perform under government supervision. The club's leaders ensured lyrics weren't overtly political, but for many, even subtle metaphors about alienation, control, and hope were enough to resonate. Kino's songs were deceptively simple, short verses, few chords, but inside them was something profound, the quiet anger of a generation raised in silence. Their early work, including the albums 45 and Noche, established them as a cult band, but it wasn't until Grupa Krovi that they were launched into international fame. Released in 1988, Grupa Krovi was a departure from the playful irony of other Soviet rock bands. It was stark, poetic, and filled with a sense of quiet defiance. Grupa Krovi became an anthem of disillusionment, but also a metaphor for an entire generation trapped in a machine beyond their control. Zvezda po imeni Solnce reflected on fate, time, and mortality with a haunted inevitability. Despite increasing liberalization under Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policy, censorship was still a reality. But Kino's music spread faster than the authorities could contain. Bootleg tapes traveled across the Soviet Union, passed from hand to hand. By 1989, Tsoi was a rock star, one of the few the USSR ever had. Then came Peremian. songs capture a moment, others define an era. Peremien did both. It was not a demand, it was a prophecy. The song wasn't officially released, but spread like wildfire through underground recordings. The song was played at protests, student gatherings, and even at political rallies. For the first time in decades, Soviet youth felt they had a voice. In June 1990, Kino played one of the biggest concerts in Soviet history in Moscow. 62,000 people attended, chanting Tsoi's lyrics like a rallying cry. But just 2 months later, tragedy struck. On August 15, 1990, Viktor Tsoi was driving home from a fishing trip in Latvia when his car collided with a bus. His death shocked the Soviet Union. The official cause was fatigue. He had likely fallen asleep at the wheel. He was just 28 years old. Thousands gathered at his funeral, and his final recordings were released as the Black Album. Fans painted "Tsoi is alive" across walls in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and beyond, a phrase that remains today. History moves forward, but echoes remain. From the streets of St. Petersburg to the protests in Belarus, from old cassette tapes to digital playlists, Viktor Tsoi's voice is still here. He didn't live to see the Soviet Union collapse, but in a way, he helped bring it down. His music is a reminder that no empire, no system, no silence lasts forever. History has a way of repeating itself, not always in the same form, but always with the same essence. Viktor Tsoi's songs once gave voice to a generation suffocating under the weight of state control, forced to play along in a system that they never chose. Today, his music resonates once more, not only in Russia, but across Ukraine in the voices of those who resist oppression, just as he did. During the late 1980s, Tsoi's lyrics became an anthem against the Stalian system that sent its youth into unwinnable wars. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had left thousands of young men dead, many of them drafted against their will. Today, Russian soldiers find themselves in a similar situation, another war that they didn't ask for, one that echoes the past in haunting ways. The Kremlin's so-called special military operation against Ukraine, launched in 2022, is not just a war on tanks and missiles. It's a war of silence. Those who speak against it, just as those who spoke against the Soviet regime, face arrest, censorship, or worse. Independent media has been shut down, protests are crushed, and critics are labeled as traitors. Yet, despite this, people still gather, and Tsoi's words are still sung in defiance. When the war in Ukraine began, Viktor Tsoi's Peremien resurfaced as a song of resistance. In Moscow, it was sung at anti-war protests before riot police stormed the crowd. In Kiev, Ukrainian fighters blasted it from speakers mounted on their military vehicles. Tsoi's voice now standing against the very forces of repression he once fought. Even today, despite government's effort to erase dissent, people leave flowers at the Tsoi wall in Moscow, a memorial that authorities repeatedly try to paint over, but no matter how many times they wipe it clean, the words "Tsoi is alive" always reappear. Viktor Tsoi never lived to see the Soviet Union collapse, but his music helped break its silence. He sang of change, and that change came. Yet today, his voice is needed once more. In Ukraine, in Russia, in every place where power tries to erase truth, Tsoi's songs still play. His voice reminds us that no regime is eternal, no war lasts forever, and no silence can hold back the tide of history. Сегодня кому-то говорят «до свидания», завтра скажут «прощай навсегда», завтра кто-то, вернувшись домой, состанет в руинах свой города. Peremien is still coming, and somewhere, someone is still listening.